Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in campaigning and community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe. Dunn Street develops community engagement and organising strategies to win campaigns both big and small. And Dunn Street trains engagement staff, volunteers and organisers in leadership and power building. And if you want to create change within your community in 2023, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. When you need support with a legal issue, it can feel very daunting. And that's why for over 100 years, Maurice Blackburn has been helping guide clients with their legal needs. And they're here to help you when you need them the most, from workplace to medical injuries, class actions, occupational diseases, and wills and estates planning. And every time I read out wills and estates planning, it reminds me I need to get my will done. As Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, they have the local knowledge and the national network with experience that you can count on. And to find out more, just go to mauriceblackburn.com.au for more help. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, and the lists that are up to date, and the phone banks that change the minds, and the emails that drive the donations, and events that's going to energise the community both online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, visit their website, swiftfoxcrm.com, to win your next campaign. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your favourite weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, out every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaigns of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. The ALP National Conference is coming up. It's in the latter half of August, so it's almost just over a month away. And a part of the conference is the Fringe program, and the Fringe program has been getting bigger and bigger each conference. And this year's program is being run by the Chifley Research Centre, which is the official think tank for the Australian Labor Party. And David Epstein, who's a former Chief of Staff to Kim Beazley and to Kevin Rudd, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, among many other things, is now the Executive Director for Chifley Research. And he's going to be on the show today to talk a bit about what Chifley's doing, but also about the Fringe program coming up. And if you are an organisation that wants to have an event at the Fringe, Socially Democratic are going to be there. We're doing 2 shows in front of an audience, which will be fun. Please come along if you're in Brisbane. David's on the show to talk about how you can get involved, although time is running out. You need to put in your applications pretty soon. By the way, the links to all of those things will be in the bio of the podcast as well. So looking forward to talking to David on today's show. And if you like the show, be sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcast or on Spotify when you're done listening to the show. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify and Stitcher. And for all the updates, follow Dunn Street on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And the other one, what's the other one called? The one that Meta created that's the rival to Twitter. Threads. Are we on Threads now? Technically. And follow us on Threads as well. There you go. Thank you. That was Rebecca, the producer, just give us a bit of a hand there. All right, let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Thursday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. And joining me on the line is the Executive Director for the Chifley Research Centre, David Epstein. Welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you, Stephen.
That's a lovely log cabin you're dialing in from today. Are you doing any whittling this afternoon and smoking a pipe and anything like that, reading some Mark Twain?
No, I've got the afternoon lined up for a bit of work and banjo playing, but
oh, different film altogether. Rightio. Now, we've got you on the show today. Primarily, I want to talk to you about Chifley and your role there, but also we're coming up to the ALP National Conference in August this year in Brisbane and the Fringe program that will be taking place simultaneously. But before we do that, I actually wanted to, like I do with all of our guests who are the first time on the show, I want to dig deep into your past. And find out a bit the things that motivate you and brought you into this work in this great labour movement of ours. First of all, starting with, like, where did you grow up? What shaped your values as a young person that sort of led you to eventually working in a pretty illustrious career, being a chief of staff to prime ministers and working in the private sector? Where were the formative moments of David Epstein?
The formative moments of David Epstein were in Western Victoria, just outside Geelong, and I went to school in Geelong. And I suppose I grew up in what you describe as a broadly Labor household, but not a particularly active Labor household. So that's where I got my values from my father and my mother, and a few other people encouraged me along the way. And I joined the Labor Party just ahead of the 1980 federal election campaign, which was a bit of a brutal federal election campaign to become a volunteer on, but there we go.
What motivated you to do that?
Basically a commitment to Labor. Probably when I was a couple of years younger than that, I was a bit even to the left of Labor, but I thought this was the way to actually engage in what I call practical, rational, progressive politics. Was actually aimed at doing something in power rather than throwing stones from the fringe.
It's funny you said that, I think a lot of us who have joined the Labor Party do come from families that are Labor families, but their parents aren't active in any way, shape or form. My parents are the same as well. And I remember I was quite nervous about actually saying to my parents, I'd like to join the Labor Party. And I don't know why I felt like that, but I sort of looked at my parents and went, they're Labor people, but they're not active, right? So I thought there must be a reason why they're not doing that. And I was 16, 17, and it took me like 6 months to get up the gumption to say to my dad, I'd like to join the Labor Party. He said, oh, yeah, sure, go for it. What shaped your political, not even your politics, your ideology, but your values you mentioned your parents were influential in that. But what did they do? What were the things that you saw as a young person that sort of said, this is an important thing to us?
Oh, look, when I was really young, they were, both reasonably active in the anti-Vietnam War and anti-conscription movements. So that was a bit of an exposure to things. And of course, I saw the election of the Whitlam government and then the dismissal of that, particularly my father's reaction to that and reaction of his friends. And then, growing up in what was a very unionised and manufacturing-oriented town in Geelong, you got exposed to a lot of other people who had those sorts of values, and also the practical, implications of, workforce politics and industrial issues at the time.
So you joined the party in 1980. Not a great election result for the party. Why did you stick it out?
Well, actually, I joined it the year before that, but look, stuck it out because was genuinely committed. In those days, I was a quite strong supporter of Bill Hayden and the work he was doing to sort of get us back on the rails. Perhaps the more horrifying election for me as a teenager was the 1977 one. That was a pretty brutal one, but also our reaction to that. A lot of work had to be done to put particularly the Federal Party, back on the rails, back looking at its policy agenda, back looking at, how it could be electable again rather than navel gazing. And I was pretty strongly motivated by that. And while, the 1980 federal election wasn't the best of experiences, we certainly demonstrated that we could campaign, and we did perform strongly, even though we had our internal divisions at the time, because quietly ticking along behind things, there was a nascent leadership contest, which wasn't settled until 1983, obviously. By which stage I'd got myself to university up in Canberra, and I was a bit more of a spectator in those days because I was sort of focusing on being an undergraduate and all the things that undergraduates do. But
when did that shift from being a spectator to a participant happen? How did that journey begin?
Look, I was lucky enough to in my first couple of years at university to fall into a circle of people who included Labor staffers in the final years of the then Labor opposition. And they would get you to volunteer to do, minor research tasks or, help draft policy papers and things like that. I had a close friend who worked for a fellow called Chris Herford, who at that stage, was in the Shadow Treasury portfolio, and I got sent off to a few conferences on industrial issues, on economic policy, and I sort of gradually got sucked into the system, as it were. And I thought this looks like a good thing to do. And then of course we won government, so they had less need for people with minimal skills like I had at the time. So I found myself first of all briefly working as an industrial officer for a thing called the Armed Forces Federation of Australia, which was attempting to create a Defence Forces union. It didn't get terribly far, but the thing about it was, because it was a, new organisation and a relatively radical concept, I got to work on a lot of things that I might not have at that age. And then I drifted into the Federal Parliamentary Library, working in an element of the research service, and ironically on media monitoring, etc., which I did briefly. And then I managed to find myself a job with a fellow called Ted Robertson, who was then a Labor senator in the Northern Territory, who retired just ahead of the 1987 election. But that sort of got my foot in the door, and after that I went to work for Gordon Bilney MP, who's sadly now dead, who had worked for Gough Whitlam as Gough Whitlam's Foreign Affairs Advisor in government. Very interesting fellow, dentist turned diplomat, extremely bright, somewhat of an Andersonian skeptic intellectually, which made for some interesting conversations, but he also was very encouraging of young staff to get involved in policy discussions. And in those days, caucus committees were perhaps more active than they are these days in terms of policy discussions around both emerging policy and approval of cabinet proposals for legislation, etc. So you got to do a lot of interesting and deep policy work, intellectually stimulating work, and you got to make some pretty good networks. So I worked for him for a while in both Canberra and Adelaide until John Dawkins picked me up as what was called a ministerial private secretary, with the somewhat interesting job of helping to persuade the broader Labor Party and caucus members about the merits of this thing that eventually became the HEC scheme. So that was my first job as a serious policy advisor, and I kept at that until basically the cusp of the 1990 federal campaign, where I was seconded to Bob Hawke's office to run advanced programming and schedule designing for the 1990 federal election campaign, which I did. And then after that, I was asked whether I would briefly go and work with a new minister called Ros Kelly to set up her office before Bob Hawke gave me a try at running what was called the Ministerial Media Group and the now somewhat notorious National Media Liaison Service, which was basically a combination of the federal government's national media network and running the coordination of media support for non-cabinet ministers. So I had a pool of press secretaries working for me, and also a pool of officers in all state capitals plus Townsville, which I did under both Bob Hawke and Paul Keating.
Does that media group have another nickname?
It was called the Animals.
I thought it was. I didn't want to say, is this the infamous Animals?
Yeah,
I've never
yeah.
heard it by
So,
any other
I
name
mean,
other than the animals. I've never heard what the official title was. That's incredible. Okay,
yeah.
rightio. This is
We might have
significant.
committed a few sins, but it was not quite the multitude of sins that were attributed to us. But anyway.
Right. Well, I mean, we haven't even got up to some of the work you did for Labor in opposition, and then obviously into the next government. But I mean, one thing that I've discovered over my time in Labor Party politics, or even more broadly in the union movement, and the Labor movement, and if I ever give advice to any young people who want to get involved, is that once you sort of get your foot in the door, and there may be times where in that journey you're despondent, or you're not enjoying the work, or there's real challenges in what you're doing, that you sort of feel like, I just want to chuck it in and go do something completely different. But I've always said to people that if you stay in the room long enough, other doors do open, other opportunities do present itself. And just listening to you talk about some of the progression of, first we'll go into this ANU, and then someone asking you, hey, can you help us write some policy papers, to then all of a sudden working through all the way to heading up the animals, right? If you think back on your journey, what are some of the things that you would advice you'd give to younger people right now that listen to this show about wanting to embark on a career within the Labor Party or the Labor movement?
Look, the first message I'd give to people is very much a post-pandemic, post-COVID message, because we're talking remotely today and a lot of people are still working remotely. But I'm a big believer in learning just by literally being in the back of the room and being prepared to do the work. I learned so much and got so many opportunities by literally just watching the conversation, learning from people how policy discussions occurred, how networking occurred, how people managed interpersonal relationships. And, basically when good conversations are held that allow a range of views to be worked through and teased out, you can come up with some good and really positive results and some really good reforms. So that's what I'd say to people. Unfortunately, one observation I would make is, because we are very much more credentials driven these days than when I was experiencing my early career, often people don't get the sort of opportunities that we, and indeed I had, very early in their 20s, for example, because they're still going through postgraduate training or whatever, or people are so credentials driven that they will only let people in the room or to participate if they have a credential. So we got opportunities pretty early, and they're given to us on a fairly flexible basis. Now, I'm not saying that's an entirely good thing, but I think it is a bit tougher these days. I got given the role of heading the media unit nationally at age 26. It was a fantastic opportunity. People just wouldn't get there these days. Now, part of that is also because of people my age and, more to the point, slightly older. The baby boom generation. There was a bit of a hump, as indeed there is in a lot of workplaces, where that generation who got opportunities earlier when the country was growing and had a smaller population basically have formed a bit of a logjam for people coming through. But that's, we're about to go, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're about to go through another period where there will be, I think, another opening up of opportunities for people at a relatively early stage in their working careers.
At the height of that sort of 1990s era, Labor's stocks, both at a national level but also at a state level, I guess it was probably at its apex, right? I mean, after that, we lost in Victoria and South Australia and WA. You've experienced the highs, but you've also been at the epicenter as a staffer in the more challenging period as well. And now we're back at the sort of apex, right? I want to get a sense of your own lessons that you learned when you're working, for example, in the Beazley opposition. What were some of the key lessons that you take away from that era that we need to hold on to?
Well, that was a pretty tough era. Federally, we'd obviously seen some changes at the state level, but because we remained in power for so long nationally, we sort of weren't necessarily used to having a big fall. We'd gone through what we thought might have been a near-death experience in 1993, but had prevailed, and in some senses probably paid the price for that because we were so elated that we won. We sort of forgot why we won and what we had to do. And then, obviously we lost power in 1996. You lose all the resources of power. There was a major generational change, but it wasn't a complete generational change. And, there were the starting of, what has afflicted, I think, both sides of politics, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, of some of the unresolved leadership tensions. There wasn't initially for Kim Beazley, but there certainly was post, his second term as leader after the 1998 poll. Where he had come close, and indeed had got a bare majority of the primary vote, but not of the seats. And as a staffer, that was sometimes tough to manage, and for me as a chief of staff, I had to also spend a lot of time managing and consoling people working with me because it was pretty despairing for them at times. I mean, they had worked pretty hard between 1996 and 1998, for example, to try and get back into power. They'd seized it as an opportunity to try some new policy directions, and there were some interesting conversations about, earned tax credits and all sorts of things, and reforms of social policy. And it was clear to people, you actually can't try and govern from opposition for a start. And then you've got to be mindful of the fact that opposition's a tough place, and it's not necessarily just about, policy and reform and looking forward. It's actually a lot of it's about internal processes and internal contests. And that would be very dispiriting for, some of the staff, particularly the younger staff you'd have working alongside you, because they'd come in with a lot of ambition. They come in with a lot of idealism, and they suddenly find themselves in an environment that's not particularly well resourced, where some of the contests are actually not about what they think are the important things that they're working for, but they're more personality or internally politically driven, and they can be quite destructive, particularly when you've got leadership contests going on. So that was sort of pretty hard to manage, and it meant you had to pay a lot of attention to managing other people through, coaxing them through, as it were, in the hope that you could get in a position where you'd be electable again. Yeah.
I want to have a conversation about the policy and the creation of ideas. And in my mind, I kind of want to talk about it now, just because we're talking about sort of that period of when we're in isolation, that period of out of government. But I actually think maybe we can pick it up when we talk more about both what's going on at Chifley right now and also the Fringe coming up as well. So maybe let's pick up that thread later. So you're now at you're the executive director at the Chifley Research Centre. For those people that don't know what the Chifley Research Centre is, do you want to give us a bit of a background on the role that Chifley plays?
Yeah, sure. Chifley Research Centre is in effect the official think tank of the Labor Party. We share directors in common. All of our board members are, obviously party members. Both the national secretary and the federal Labor leader have a fair say in who might be nominated as board members. But our board, by quite a deliberate process, is a fairly balanced one. It tries to represent all factors and tendencies within the party nationally. What we don't do is perform as a traditional think tank might, because we have, some institutional responsibility. So we're not purely about employing rooms and rooms of researchers. In fact, we generally don't. What we tend to do is commission research or conduct research in partnership. But we also have functions in terms of being the loose guardians of labour history. We act as an engagement organisation and a cultural relationship organisation for people who may not necessarily be party members, but are what I'd call certainly intellectual and ideological fellow travellers. So we maintain what we call our action network, which goes into the tens of thousands of people, but not all of them would necessarily be formal Labor Party members, but you would certainly see them all turn out for the Labor Party polling booths in election campaign. They are, as I said, intellectual and ideological fellow travellers. So we try and run a program that keeps them engaged and involved, that's outside of what I'd call the institutional Labor Party framework. And then we have a professional, what I'd call a professional political development program, where we are trying to develop human capacity within the broader Labor movement for people who might be office bearers or potential parliamentarians, or indeed, senior policy staffers, etc., etc. So we tend to run that around a federal electoral cycle, and it varies a bit, depending on where the party sits and how many people we've got in Parliament, etc., etc. But the last major one we ran across the last election campaign. I've just been invaded by a dog.
We have a guest on the podcast. It's good.
The guest dog. I don't know whether he'll have anything to say, but we ran a professional development program for the class of 2019 federal parliamentarians, and we identified 8 people on a fairly balanced basis geographically, male and female, and also by their sort of ideological balance within the various groups of the party. And I'm pleased to say that 4 of them became first-time frontbenchers when the Albanese government was elected. So we will continue to do that this year. It's a bit unusual in terms of our longer-term operating cycle this year, because we're basically in the first operating year of a federal Labor government. So there's less need for us to commission primary research or to kick off new debates like we might do when the party's in opposition and lacks the resources of government, obviously, and also has more time to do these things, because frontbenchers, particularly at this stage in the political cycle, are very much involved in implementing some of the things that we might have generated from Chifley and other research institutions attached with the Labor Party. So, for example, during the last term of federal Labor opposition, we did a lot of work on early childhood and childcare and things like that, and that emerged into some published research papers. Some of it was expanded by, what I'd call the broader family of Labor-oriented think tanks, and to name a few, there's Per Capita, there's McKell, there's John Curtin, etc., etc. We don't seek to compete with them. We seek to collaborate and partner and indeed facilitate where we can. And then we also work with people who are very keen on Labor history. So we have an ongoing digital Labor history program. We also support publication of certain books, like Nick Dyer-Firth and Frank Bongiorno had a little history of Labor. They're working on another one there, and we're very proud to support that project.
Let's take a quick break to talk about SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust. Lists that are up to date, absolutely. Phone banks that can change minds. Emails that drive donations, and events that will energise the community online and offline. And text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. And to find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign. Okay, let's get back to the show. You, I know you mentioned before, obviously a lot of the work that Chifley had done when in opposition is now, we're seeing the fruits of that labour, if I can pardon the pun, in government now. And yet you're right. I mean, obviously there isn't an election for quite some time. This new federal government is, in its infancy. But is it looking forward into the future, is there a time to start to build the foundations of having a conversation about what are the policy battle lines in the future, either with our opponents on the left or on the right? So I'm just going to I'm interested to get a sense from you anyway. Maybe Mikkel hasn't got to a situation. Sorry, Chifley has not got to a situation where it's starting to think about that. But what are you thinking about in terms of where do we want to start to have a conversation?
Look, there's what I think about, and there's what Chifley thinks about, and there's what some of my board members also think about. But look, those tasks never go away, Stephen. What I suppose they do is they do move in ebbs and flows, particularly when you're coming back into government. But in saying we're not doing much of that this year, what we have been focusing on is some of our engagement that will draw out the threads of the next conversations or the next research explorations or policy discussions. So every federal electoral cycle, we run what's called the Chifley Conference. We ran it in February of this year, Chifley 23. The first stage of that was a bit reflective on, where is the community at? What problems is the community facing? What does that mean in terms of how Labor should engage and campaign? The other bit of it was the Prime Minister leading the calendar year conversation, as it were, on The Voice, and federal ministers explaining what was unfolding. But since then, we've moved on. We've recently just, held a joint exercise with what started off as a US Democrat think tank, Progressive Politics International, who have now expanded to both London and Brussels. And we did a bit of an exploration on what some of European progressive governments have learnt about coming out of the pandemic, about expectations on policy delivery and how that changes patterns of governing. So we'll explore a bit of that. But we're also starting to look at things, and you'll see some of this in our fringe programming this year, things like the balance between work and care. What, for example, does it mean for family life and indeed, caring for children in an environment where there's large amounts of permanent casual work, which might be on paper permanent, but the way it's actually delivered fluctuates quite a bit, and it makes it very, very difficult, for some people, not just to manage their income streams, but also just to manage how they live their lives outside the workplace, and what effect it has on their dependents. So we're going to look at that sort of thing. We'll look at the implications of education and training, particularly in areas that are affected by what I broadly call energy transition. And that's not just the energy supply sector or energy distribution. It's things like housing, electrical components, manufacturing, etc. And we'll probably look at housing quite broadly on a federal and state basis, because, I think we're all seeing what's happening in public debate there.
Unpacking some of those things, actually go one step back. What were some of the reflections from Chifley 23? You talked about examining the problems and challenges that community is facing at the moment. What were some of the reflections that came out of that conference?
Well, there there was some interesting things. It was the pace of community expectations. The community is expecting governments to respond faster and more tangibly to economic challenges as they emerge, and the classic would be the cost of housing and the impact of inflation coming. In Australia at that stage, we were dealing with the inflationary effects of Ukraine and the ongoing supply channel problems, but we were also dealing with climatic effects and things like that. There was very high food prices, and now we're starting to see both the impact on energy prices and interest rates. People are no longer content with what I'd call remote institutional responses, or purportedly apolitical ones. So they don't necessarily buy the argument that privatised commercial service delivery is good. They don't necessarily buy the argument that institutions of government and power outside elected government should be given, high degrees of autonomy and quite, intellectually, rationally driven means of responding to problems. They want direct answers from elected governments. So how do you respond to that in a rational way and in an ethical way? How do you respond to the calls for policy changes in policy responses, which we may not have seen over the last 20 to 25 years as we've sort of drifted down what was, quote unquote, an economically rational path to, what might more properly be described as, fundamentalist capitalism. It's sort of working through some of those things without encountering the issues that you tend to encounter from mainstream media and what I'd call lagging the lagging zeitgeist of how some people believe that public policy should be prosecuted. The general public are expecting something a bit more direct, a bit more engaged than necessarily what the ruling elites might be comfortable with, given how they've been operating over the last 20 to 25 years. And it's adjusting government to that, but it's also trying to do it in a way where you can remain true to your progressive and longer term ambitions, rather than just purely becoming weather vanes of public opinion or public anxiety.
The country is so big these days, and I feel that, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this, the diversity of challenges that communities are facing varies from different parts of the nation, right? Like, when luckily enough in my job, I do travel a little bit. And so when I'm up in Queensland and talking to our colleagues up there, there's a lot of kind of, it's a different kind of vibe than down in Victoria, and I agree with it, but also I kind of disagree with it in the sense that I think that broadly speaking, we are a reasonably homogenous nation, but I also acknowledge the fact that there are unique challenges that might be going on in regional Queensland that might differ from someone living in regional Victoria. But I also think there are commonalities as well, and getting that link when creating policy or campaigning to them about how do we create change, how do we make your lives better, is something that's difficult to grapple with, I think, from a campaign perspective. I'm not a policy person by any stretch of the imagination, but sometimes policies have to be, I'm wondering, do they have to be detailed to that specific community? Like if we talk about transition, right, in the coal industry in Queensland, do we need to come up with niche policy ideas to support those communities as opposed to this sort of big catch-all kind of policy solution right across the country about transitions from all these different industries that are starting to wind up. I want to get your thoughts on how do we manage that, right?
Yeah. Well, look, it's interesting you raise that, Stephen, because it's very much something that we're wrestling with as we program the Fringe conference next to the ALP National Conference. Because
nice segue, David, too.
Well, I thank you for that, but it wasn't actually an intended segue. It was an accidental one. But we have a big national institution with people from all around the countryside crossing the Tweed, as it were, into southeast Queensland. So we start with an institutional challenge. Well, we're dealing with a national institution, national processes. How do we actually make it relevant to the area we've landed in? And it doesn't necessarily have to be Queensland, but it is Queensland on this occasion, and Queensland is a very regional state. And as you've pointed out, it has some distinct concerns and approaches that may not necessarily play perfectly well in Victoria, or may not appear to be analogous to Victorians, but you'd be surprised. So we're sort of trying to deal with that sort of thing, but it's also reflecting, as you say, a bit of a trend with Australia having grown. We're a massive, the population of the country is more than double what it was when I was a young teenager. That's a massive growth. More than 40% of us, are either first-time migrants or the descendants of first-time migrants. It's a tremendous success story that we and possibly the Kiwis also have been able to manage amongst OECD nations, and a lot of people are actually turning to us to see how we did it. But that's not to say we've had a perfect result. But you do need to be mindful that this has occurred in a big continent, and it does have implications. Issues occur regionally that can be quite different to those in the outer metropolitan areas, which are in turn different to those in the inner metropolitan areas. But that's been exacerbated by our overall growth in population, and some of the economic transitions that occur have also exacerbated some of the diversity. So how do you look at progressive public policy and progressive outcomes and progressive ambitions at that national level, but deal with community and place? And to use what's often a cliche term, I think you've got to take a very holistic approach, but you've got to be a lot more mindful of it these days than you may have had to be in the past, because the diversity is greater, the scale is greater, and because there's so much weight of the country sitting in metropolitan and coastal, particularly east coastal Australia, you've got to be mindful of not leaving people behind. How do you deal with those towns in, say, the Post-Blue Mountains arc of Western New South Wales, up and down regional Queensland, and we all know the stories of regional Queensland. Brisbane is closer to Melbourne than it is to Townsville.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
And then you've got Cairns onward, but you've got all of those regional centres into the western heartland of Queensland, which have really had to change their lifestyles. And then as you come further down into the mining and energy sector areas, they're people that are absolutely facing the first wave of the serious energy transition. And we can look after them, but we've also got to make sure that they understand they're going to be looked after, because people can become very alienated if they're not kept in the picture, as it were. So it is quite important to have that holistic approach, but also to be mindful when you've got a national agenda and national ambitions, not to forget community and place. And how do we do that without making those national objectives fall apart?
And it's interesting you talk about that, because it's something that I've been thinking about a little bit recently and talking to people in public policy areas, and it was something that actually wasn't something that was put into my mind by Marshall Gantz, so it's not my own original idea, but he was talking about the link between public policy and development of civic policy being the brain and the work of community organising, as in going in and working with constituencies in place as being the body and connecting the two. So not just coming up with ideas, but also working with communities in place and saying to them, what are the challenges that you're facing? Why is it a challenge? What is the hope that you have for your community going forward? So therefore articulating essentially what a shared purpose looks like. Why haven't you sought to try and fix it already? What can you do? What's stopping you from doing it? Therefore starting to articulate the early foundations of a strategy of then working out, well, what does the strategic goal look like? What do these solutions look like? And how do we as a community actually start to organise our resources to achieve that? And we're seeing that in Gippsland, where I'm from, because obviously, as you know, you're native Victorian, the coal industry there is closing down. That community there that have been, in terms of jobs, have been relying on working in that industry. All of my cousins have all, my family migrated to that area because there was work there from Scotland, right? They're not wedded to the idea of working in coal, but they're very proud of the fact that they work in the energy sector and that they are the people that keep the lights on for the people of Victoria. And so there's a lot of push now towards renewables, right? Offshore wind being one of them, but also onshore renewable energy as well. And a lot of these folks down there are saying, I want to work in that industry if I can. That would be great. And actually sitting down with those communities and actually saying, well, then how do we make this actually work? And not having to necessarily force all the heavy lifting on government or public policy people in the intellectual class, and actually, but connecting the two of them, connecting the brain with the body. And I'm interested in the theme of this year's Fringe program for the ALP National Conference, which is contribute to good progressive policy, explore ideas, and build connections. And I want to get a sense from you, David, about what are the goals of this particular Fringe program for Chifley and for the party.
Yeah. Well, look, it's not just about building connections, for the optics of it, or propagandist connections. It's actually about genuine, ongoing conversations. So what we want to try and do is engage people who might engage with the Labor Party and with government occasionally, but not consistently, give them a more consistent platform from which they can engage, and get the party, when it's gathered together nationally, to do that. As I said, we're hoping to place an emphasis on community and place in some of our discussions. But we're also hoping to give those who don't necessarily have a big national voice or the resources of a national voice some opportunity. So we're deliberately going out to find partnerships and sponsorships for smaller groups who might come in and engage in the Fringe literally for just a couple of hours. Why for a couple of hours? Because they can't afford either the time or the money to do it on any other occasion. So, bring people together, try and create some environments for safe but quite frank conversations. I was up in Brisbane yesterday at QUT with some of the specialists they've got there in community engagement and not-for-profit organisation management. And they said to me, please, can you try a concept of what we call the unconference, where you deliberately set up a room where people can have a conversation that's a bit more frank, a bit more honest, but they don't feel that they're going to be punished afterwards, and they don't feel as community organisations that you're really just looking for them as a cheap form of service delivery.
Yeah.
That there's actually an ethical question about sometimes they need to be paid commercial rates so that they can employ people to do the thinking time, the engaging time, and more to the point, the advocacy, and sort of say, okay, well, look, there's been some delegated service delivery to what you'd broadly call the third sector. here are some issues, or more to the point, and this came up several times yesterday in my conversations. You'll have organisations that are getting direct or indirect funding, or have direct or indirect relationships with multiple government agencies and indeed political organisations, purely so they can be heard, or they can assemble enough funding to be able to run their organisation. But none of the conversations are connected. And indeed, as a result of that, the institutions of power or funding are setting objectives and trying to impose a sort of contractual framework, as it were, some sort of performance order on these organisations that is conflictual. So an organisation might be drawing a pool of $100, $30 from the health department, $30 from the education department, and the remaining 40 from 12 different agencies, all of whom have different objectives, and some of them actually conflict. But to be part of the conversation with government and political institutions, or part of the funding cycle, they've got to play to all those expectations. And what's happening is the people that they're meant to be serving, the communities, are not getting the best results, because you're getting less than optimal consideration of what policy frameworks should be to, for example, reinvigorate an alternate energy future for the people of Gippsland.
Talk us through the Fringe program, and it's something that I'm really glad that the party embraced this a number of years ago. I was lucky enough to go to the Labor Party conference in Manchester in 2012, 11, 9, anyway, one of those years. Huge. If anyone's ever been to a Labor Party conference in the UK, it's massive. Like, cities bid for the right to host the damn thing because of the influx of people that come into that city, and it moves up and down the country from Liverpool to Manchester to Brighton and whatnot. It's such an impressive, awesome week, and it's not just people from the UK. Obviously, people come from overseas to participate in this dialogue, right? And the conference is going on, but then there's this Fringe program going on as well. I remember I got handed the Fringe program booklet. It was thicker than the Bible. And there was so much stuff to go see and check out. I was flat out the whole week just going and checking out Fringe events. And I know the first attempt at the party doing this, the Australian Labor Party doing this a number of years ago, I was just so pleased that they were giving this a go. And each year I've seen it, each conference I've seen it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I always want to get a sense from you, David, what are the ambitions going into this Fringe program in terms of bringing people together, sharing ideas, the diversity of that? Talk us through what's been the response so far, and maybe also how people can get involved if they wanted to do so.
Well, Stephen, as you say, it is a growing thing. In some senses we've probably copied off the British, but we've been a lot smaller, although we got quite big. The last one we held at the site of the Adelaide ALP National Conference. We haven't quite got to the stage where Australian cities are competing for Labor Party conferences. They might compete not to have us. I don't know. Although I'm old enough to remember when Hobart did support the ALP National Conference, which the ALP used to like too, because it was always held in the West Point Casino, which was extremely hard for people to get to because. So therefore you didn't get a lot of protest or dissent, but particularly in the early years of the Hawke government. But look, more seriously, it is getting bigger. We're not at the stage yet, like the British Labor Party conference. I mean, I think they attract a broader audience of 30 to 40,000 people get involved or dragged into a town in some form or another. They may not directly participate in the conference, but they'll certainly be interested, in the Fringe, and they might be working in the accommodation industry, etc., etc. Fringe is intended. Fringe, unlike the main conference, which is for delegates, you can go along to the main conference and you can be an observer, etc. Fringe is open to anyone. You pay your ticket, and there's very reduced rates for people who are unwaged audience members, as opposed to those who are on wages. And you get your ticket for 3 days, and you'll get to experience the Fringe, all the stalls we have, the fringe of fringe events, and I suspect we will get close to around 100 events or related events. Not all of them will be our Fringe events, and there'll certainly be events, I think, in venues around the main Brisbane Convention Centre. At the moment, I think I'm looking at close to 120 EOIs from organisations that either want to hold an event or do a presentation, etc., in addition to those who want to just be stall holders and attend. So we've already got both the main conference itself and the Fringe have got their own separate web platforms. At the moment, we're focused on people who want to be event presenters, so we don't have a lot of detail about our program. We will follow the major themes of the main conference to some degree, but what we also bring is the other elements of cultural and entertainment engagement, a bit of Labor history, and the opportunity for broader conversations. I mean, not just a broader range of topics, but more freewheeling, because we're not about voting on particular motions or anything like that. We're about having conversations and opening the basis of conversation up. So, if I was to, sort of look at the main conference, it will begin with a focus on the economy. It will then move to climate, the environment, energy security, and then to themes around a healthier society. On day 2, it talks about Australia's place in the world and international engagement, strengthening Australia's democracy, before having motions and conversations about opening the doors of opportunity. And then the final third day is, very much about ALP organisational things, the constitution and organisational stuff. We won't have that ALP side of things, but we will have conversations about housing, emerging environmental issues, emerging energy trends issues in the broader sense, not just purely environmental policy, the balance of work and care, the education and training, some of the things I was talking about personally. We'll have a bit about exploring emerging community attitudes to things, how we respond to that in Australia compared to how people might be thinking about responding to it overseas. We'll have some presentations about research. We'll have some presentations about campaigning. We'll hopefully have a number of fora enabling community groups to raise some what they think are issues that don't receive enough attention at the moment, but equally have the opportunity for a bit of mentoring and engagement with people who are currently, holding levers in governments or the institution of the Labor Party more broadly.
That's great. So first of all, if there are any folks out there listening to the show that are interested in actually putting in an expression of interest to host or run a program, a part of the Fringe, is there still time to get in a submission?
Look, formally we've sort of closed that off and we're very much in the consideration process, but we're not being inflexible. All I would say to people is stick your hands up very hard and very fast. You can go straight to the Labor Fringe website and there is a form there and just stick in an EOI or get on the phone to me. You'll have the details there via the website. I'm not going to broadcast it here. I don't want everyone ringing me. So what I'm saying is we're sort of rapidly approaching the stage where we've actually got to put the conference together, and we've got a lot on our plate in terms of people expressing interest, but we're not completely closed-minded.
Fantastic.
Just be quick and be very thoughtful.
Very good. And for those who want to buy a ticket or purchase a ticket to the Fringe, are those available yet? Or if not, when will they be?
They will be available soon, and we'll post that again online via both the National Conference website itself and the Labor Fringe websites, and they'll be able to be purchased online. So it'll be $20 for the unwaged and $60 for 3 days for people who are earning an income. So the place to go to is laborfringe.org.au. If you want to have a broader look at what the actual formal Labor conference has got on offer, go to laborconference.org.au/agenda. If you want to learn more about Chifley and what we do, you go to www.chifley.org.au.
Fantastic. Actually, props to you, David, because every time I have guests on, I say, do you want to give anything a plug? They're scrambling to remember what their website is. So good on you that you were prepared for that. We will put those links in the bio of today's episode as well. So we'll put links to, if you want to register an expression of interest to run a program at the Fringe. We'll also put links to the main page for the Fringe and the conference, and also Chifley as well. David, once again, thank you very much for your time today. There was a whole heap of things I actually did want to ask you, particularly about your own history in the party, and maybe we'll have to get you back on the show at a later date to talk more a bit about that, because I'm fascinated. I love my Labor history, as do a lot of our listeners as well. But obviously there was a whole bunch of things we wanted to cover off today, but we do appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I'll just say on the latter point, I'd like to describe myself as a ghost in the attic, and it's probably best people don't know what I got up to.
You'd like to leave it that way. Well, this is a safe space. It's only friends on this podcast. Okay, I can assure you that.
Very compelling pitch.
Indeed. All right, we'll see you up in Brisbane pretty soon.
Absolutely. And hope to see others too.
Indeed. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser. And to get all the latest on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Today's episode of Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians, and they've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means that you'll get the best results possible. To find out more, go to their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on. Socially Democratic was brought to you by SwiftFox. Every moment on a campaign matters. You need the tools that you can trust, lists that are up to date, phone banks that can change minds, emails that drive donations, events that will energise the community online and offline, and text blasts that distill your message perfectly. SwiftFox CRM is made for campaigners by campaigners. To find out more, go to swiftfoxcrm.com to win your next campaign.